The autumn evening was settling over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as Special Agent Rodriguez pulled away from the FBI field office. Her dark blue sit-in merged smoothly into the light traffic, the events of the day still fresh in her mind. She had just wrapped up a major human trafficking case that had been consuming her life for the past 6 months. The satisfaction of seeing the perpetrators in handcuffs still brought a small smile to her face. The clock on her dashboard read 7:45 p.m. She had changed out of her formal work attire into more comfortable clothes, dark jeans and a simple navy sweater, before heading home. Her long black hair was tied back in a practical ponytail, and her minimal makeup had mostly worn off during the intense day of closing operations and paperwork. As she drove, her mind wandered to the faces of the victims they'd rescued. After 15 years in the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, cases like these still touched her deeply. She had joined the FBI with a burning desire to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and days like today reminded her exactly why she had chosen this path. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, asking about Sunday dinner. Rodriguez smiled, thinking about her family's weekly tradition. No matter how chaotic her work life got, Sunday dinners were sacred. Her mother's voice always said the same thing. Manhija, even FBI agents need to eat proper meals. The thought of her mother's famous enchiladas made her realize she hadn't eaten since lunch. The streets were quieter now as she turned onto the tree-lined avenue leading to her neighborhood. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on, casting long shadows across the pavement. She adjusted her rearview mirror, a habit from years of training and field experience. Everything looked normal, but something about the white patrol car that had been 3 cars behind her for the last few minutes caught her attention. Rodriguez checked her speedometer. She was exactly at the speed limit. Her car had just passed its annual inspection last week, so everything was in perfect order. Still, that sixth sense that had saved her life more than once during undercover operations was quietly alerting her. She took a deep breath, keeping her movements casual as she turned onto Oak Drive. The patrol car followed. She thought about the case files tucked safely in her briefcase on the passenger seat. Tomorrow, she would be starting a new investigation into reported civil rights violations within several local police departments. The irony wasn't lost on her as she watched the patrol car's headlights grow larger in her mirror. The flash of red and blue lights suddenly illuminated her car's interior. Rodriguez let out a slow breath, her trained mind already documenting every detail. The time was 7:53 p.m. The location was Oak Drive, a well-lit residential street. As she carefully pulled over, she noticed there were no other cars nearby, and most of the houses had their porch lights on. What happened next would change not just her evening, but the entire trajectory of law enforcement accountability in the Southeast region. As she waited for the officer to approach, Rodriguez's hand moved slowly toward her purse, where her FBI credentials lay hidden in a discreet compartment. But she didn't reach for them, not yet. First, she would observe, document, and understand exactly what was about to unfold. The approaching footsteps told her more than the officer probably realized. They were deliberate, heavy, slightly faster than standard procedure recommended. Her side mirror showed a tall figure approaching, hand already resting on his belt. Rodriguez kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, her face neutral, but her mind was sharp and alert, recording every detail of what was about to become a pivotal moment in both their lives. Officer Wilson stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his collar in the cool evening air. He'd been on the force for 8 years, and lately his record had raised some eyebrows at the station. His supervisor had warned him about his increasing number of complaints, but Wilson had brushed them off as people being too sensitive these days. The beam from his flashlight swept across the blue sedan's trunk before moving to the driver's window. He noticed the car was spotlessly clean, fairly new, and definitely expensive. Something about that bothered him. He'd been watching the car for the last few miles, looking for any excuse to pull it over. When no actual violation presented itself, He decided a broken taillight would do. License and registration, he barked, not even bothering with the customary greeting. His flashlight beam deliberately aimed at Rodriguez's face, making her squint. She remained perfectly still, her hands visible on the steering wheel. "Of course, officer," Rodriguez replied calmly. "My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my purse. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right." Wilson just grunted in response, his flashlight never wavering. He watched as she slowly reached for her purse, his free hand resting on his belt. The way she announced her movements irritated him, like she was trying to show him how to do his job. "This is a nice car for this neighborhood," he commented, his tone dripping with suspicion as she handed over her documents. "Where'd you get it?" "I purchased it from Thompson dealership downtown last year," Rodriguez answered evenly, noting how he was barely glancing at her license, more interested in trying to peer into her back seat. "Step out of the vehicle," Wilson demanded suddenly. "Now." "May I ask why, officer?" "I don't believe I've violated any traffic laws." Rodriguez's voice remained steady, but her trained eye caught everything. How his body language grew more aggressive, how his jaw clenched at her question. "I said out of the vehicle." His voice rose sharply. "And keep your hands where I can see them." Rodriguez carefully opened her door, noting the time on her dashboard, 7:57 p.m. Her phone was still recording in her pocket, capturing every word. As she stepped out into the chilly evening air, she saw Wilson call for backup on his radio. That was interesting. Calling for backup on a simple traffic stop. "Stand over there," he ordered, pointing to the front of her car. Hands on the hood. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant barking of a dog. Porch lights had come on in nearby houses, and Rodriguez knew there were probably witnesses behind those curtains. She could hear Wilson roughly going through her car, muttering under his breath. "You know," he called out, his voice filled with unwarranted authority, "people like you driving cars like this usually means something's not right. Where'd you really get this car from?" "As I stated before, Officer Wilson," she replied, emphasizing his name to let him know she'd been documenting everything. "I purchased it legally from Thompson dealership. Would you like their contact information?" Her response seemed to anger him further. She heard him slam her glove compartment shut. In her side mirror, she could see 2 more patrol cars approaching with their lights off. The situation was escalating exactly as she had predicted it would. "What's in this fancy briefcase?" Wilson emerged from her car holding her work bag. "Pretty suspicious having locked luggage in your car." Rodriguez remained silent, mentally counting the number of policy violations he'd already committed. No probable cause, no valid reason for the search, aggressive behavior, failure to properly identify himself or state the reason for the stop. The backup officers were stepping out of their cars now. One of them, Officer Chen, immediately looked uncomfortable with the scene before her. The other, Officer Rivera, kept glancing between Wilson and Rodriguez with growing concern. What none of them knew was that Rodriguez had been investigating their department for weeks. Every move Wilson made now was adding another page to a file that was already thick with complaints and suspicious patterns. But for now, she continued to play her role, waiting for the right moment to turn this humiliating situation into a catalyst for real change. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Wilson circled around Rodriguez's car, her locked briefcase still in his hands. The backup officers, Chen and Rivera, exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. The cool night air carried the sound of crickets and distant traffic, creating an eerie backdrop to the unfolding scene. "I'll ask you one more time." Wilson's voice took on a mocking tone. "What's in the briefcase? And don't give me any stories about work documents." Rodriguez maintained her position, hands still on the hood of her car. Her years of training helped her stay composed, even as her arms began to tire. "Officer Wilson, I've already explained that those are work-related documents. They're confidential, and you don't have probable cause to search them." Wilson's face reddened at her calm response. Oh, so now you're a lawyer too. He stepped closer, trying to intimidate her with his height. Listen here, I've dealt with plenty of people trying to act smart. The faster you cooperate, the easier this goes. Officer Chen finally stepped forward, her discomfort visible. Wilson, maybe we should. Stay out of this, Chen, Wilson snapped. I know what I'm doing. He turned back to Rodriguez. You people always think you can talk your way out of everything. Rodriguez noticed how Officer Rivera winced at Wilson's choice of words. She carefully logged that reaction in her memory. It would be important later. The dashboard clock in her car now read 8:10 p.m. 17 minutes of documented harassment and civil rights violations. Actually, Rodriguez spoke clearly, making sure her phone's recording would pick up every word. I would like to know the original reason for this traffic stop. You haven't mentioned it yet. Wilson's grip tightened on the briefcase. Broken taillight, he muttered, though all three officers knew the car's lights were perfectly fine. Really? Rodriguez kept her tone professional but firm. That's interesting, considering I had my car fully inspected last week. Would you mind showing me which light is broken? The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Officer Rivera cleared his throat, clearly wanting to intervene but unsure how. Wilson ignored them both, his frustration growing visibly with each passing moment. Turn around, he ordered suddenly. We're going to do this by the books, since you want to play it that way. Hands behind your back. Officer Chen stepped forward again. Wilson, I don't think. I said stay out of this. Wilson's voice echoed down the quiet street. Several more porch lights flicked on, and curtains twitched in nearby windows. This is my stop, I call. Rodriguez remained perfectly still, her mind racing through protocols and procedures. Wilson was digging himself deeper with every passing second. She could end this now by revealing her identity, but her investigator's instinct told her to wait. This was bigger than one traffic stop. This was about patterns of behavior that needed to be documented and addressed. Officer Wilson, she said calmly, I want to be very clear about what's happening here. You've detained me without cause, searched my vehicle without consent or probable cause, and are now threatening arrest. Would you like to reconsider your actions? Her words seemed to snap something in Wilson. He stepped closer, his face contorted with anger. That's it. You're under arrest for interfering with a police officer. Rivera, cuff her. Officer Rivera hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, I don't see any reason for. That wasn't a suggestion. Officer Rivera, Wilson barked. Either help me do my job or go back to writing parking tickets. The moment hung in the air like a suspended drop of water. Rodriguez could feel the shift in energy as Officer Chen pulled out her body camera and deliberately turned it on. Smart woman, Rodriguez thought. The evidence was piling up, and soon, very soon, this situation would reach its tipping point. Rodriguez straightened up slightly, preparing herself for what would come next. She had seen enough. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had faced this kind of treatment without having an FBI badge to protect them. The time for observation was almost over, and the time for action was approaching. The night air had grown colder, and Rodriguez could see her breath forming small clouds in the beam of the patrol car's headlights. Officer Wilson was still holding her briefcase, his knuckles white with tension. The situation had reached a critical point, and everyone present could feel it. Last chance, Wilson growled, waving the briefcase. Either you tell me what's in here, or we're going to have a real problem. He was trying to sound authoritative, but there was a slight tremor in his voice that betrayed his growing uncertainty. Rodriguez glanced at her watch, 8:17 p.m. She had given him more than enough rope to hang himself professionally. The recording in her pocket had captured every violation, every discriminatory comment, every abuse of power. But she needed just a little more. Officer Wilson, she said clearly, I'll open that briefcase for you, but first, I'd like you to answer a few questions for the record. She emphasized those last words carefully. Why did you really pull me over tonight? Wilson's face flushed red. I told you. Broken taillight. And could you point out which light is broken? Rodriguez asked calmly. Officer Chen, Officer Rivera, would you mind verifying the condition of my taillights? Chen stepped forward, her flashlight beam sweeping across the back of the car. All lights appear to be functioning properly, sir, she reported, her voice steady. Wilson's jaw clenched. That's enough. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Now. Before I do that, Rodriguez continued, her voice remaining professional, I'd like to point out that you violated several department policies in the last 25 minutes. Would you like me to list them? The veins in Wilson's neck were visibly throbbing now. You think you know police procedure. You think reading some articles online makes you an expert. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, several people holding up phones, recording the scene. Officer Rivera kept glancing between Wilson and the growing audience, clearly aware that this situation was spiraling out of control. Wilson, Rivera said quietly, maybe we should call the surgeon. Shut up, Wilson snapped. He turned back to Rodriguez, taking a step closer. I've had enough of your attitude. You people always think you're above the law. Rodriguez noted how his hand had moved to his belt, closer to his weapon. It was time. She'd seen enough officers like Wilson over her 15 years with the Bureau. Men who thought a badge gave them the right to humiliate and intimidate. Men who needed to learn that accountability wasn't just a word in the department manual. Officer Wilson, she said, her voice taking on a different tone. One of quiet authority that made all three officers straighten instinctively. I'm going to reach into my pocket very slowly. I want all three of you to watch carefully. Wilson's hand tightened on his belt. Don't you dare move. Hands where I can see them. But Rodriguez was already moving, her movements deliberate and slow. From her pocket, she pulled out not her phone, but a small leather wallet. The crowd behind them had grown silent, sensing something important was about to happen. Officer Wilson, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. I want you to look at this very carefully. Officer Chen, Officer Rivera, please come closer. You'll want to see this too. The leather wallet flipped open, revealing a golden badge that seemed to glow in the patrol car's lights. Wilson's face, already red with anger, suddenly drained of all color. The briefcase slipped from his fingers, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. My name is Special Agent Rodriguez, she announced, her voice now filled with unmistakable authority. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division. And you, Officer Wilson, have just given me exactly what I came here looking for. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped chirping. Officer Chen's hand had flown to her mouth. Officer Rivera looked like he'd seen a ghost. And Wilson stood frozen, his face a mask of dawning horror as he realized just how completely he had destroyed his own career. For several long seconds, the only sound was the quiet hum of the patrol car engines and the whispered murmurs from the watching crowd. Officer Wilson stood rooted to the spot, his face a mix of shock and disbelief as he stared at the FBI badge in Rodriguez's hand. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. I was just following procedure, Wilson finally stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. His hand had dropped away from his belt, and his shoulders had lost their aggressive stance. Rodriguez calmly tucked her badge away and retrieved her phone from her pocket. Let's review that procedure, shall we? She pressed a few buttons, and Wilson's voice filled the air, playing back his earlier comments. The recording was crystal clear, capturing every discriminatory remark, every baseless accusation. Officer Chen stepped forward, her face set with determination. Agent Rodriguez, I want to officially report that I felt uncomfortable with Officer Wilson's conduct from the moment I arrived on scene. She glanced at Wilson, then back at Rodriguez. This isn't the first time. I know, Rodriguez replied softly. That's exactly why I'm here. She turned to Officer Rivera, who looked like he was seeing the whole situation in a new light. Officer Rivera, I believe you tried to intervene several times tonight. I'd appreciate your statement as well. The crowd had grown larger, but Rodriguez paid them no attention. This wasn't about creating a spectacle. It was about accountability and change. She picked up her briefcase from where Wilson had dropped it, brushing off the dirt. Officer Wilson, she said, her voice firm but professional, in this briefcase are 37 complaints filed against you in the past year alone. Complaints that mysteriously disappeared from official records. She watched as his face went even paler. But they didn't disappear completely, did they? People kept copies. People talked. And eventually, those stories made their way to my desk. A police surgeon's car pulled up, lights flashing. Word had obviously traveled fast. Wilson seemed to shrink into himself as his superior officer approached, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. Sergeant Thompson. Rodriguez greeted him, showing her credentials again. I'm afraid we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Officer Wilson here has provided an excellent demonstration of exactly why the FBI's Civil Rights Division is currently investigating your department. The surgeon's face turned grim as he listened to the recording. Around them, the crowd had started to disperse, but not before dozens of phones had captured the entire encounter. Rodriguez knew that by morning, this would be all over social media, another tool for change. Officer Wilson. The surgeon's voice was heavy with disappointment and barely controlled anger. Hand over your badge and gun. Now. As Wilson numbly complied, Rodriguez opened her briefcase and pulled out a single document. This is a formal notice of investigation into civil rights violations within your department. I'd originally planned to deliver it tomorrow morning, but since we're all here, she handed it to the surgeon with a slight smile. The other officers watched in silence as Wilson was escorted to a patrol car, not in handcuffs, but as a man whose world had just crumbled around him. Rodriguez knew this was just the beginning. Real change would take time, persistence, and hard evidence. Evidence she now had in abundance. Agent Rodriguez. Officer Chen approached her quietly. There are other things you should know about. Other incidents. Rodriguez nodded, pulling out her business card. I'll be here for a while, Officer Chen. My office door is always open. She handed cards to both Chen and Rivera. Change starts with people willing to stand up and say enough. As she watched the patrol cars pull away, Rodriguez thought about all the people who had faced similar situations but didn't have an FBI badge to protect them. Tonight wasn't about one bad officer or one traffic stop. It was about breaking a cycle of abuse and silence. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning, Rodriguez sat in her office at the FBI field headquarters, reviewing the events from the previous night. Her computer screen displayed multiple windows, email responses from concerned citizens, official reports, and news coverage of the incident. Someone in the crowd had uploaded the video, and it had already gone viral. She took a sip of her coffee, remembering how her mother had called first thing in the morning after seeing the video on the local news. Mejija, she had said, I always knew your patience would change things one day. Rodriguez smiled at the memory, but her focus quickly returned to the task at hand. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called out, somehow not surprised to see Officer Chen standing there, holding a thick folder. Agent Rodriguez, Chen said, stepping inside and closing the door. I brought everything I could find. She placed the folder on the desk with slightly trembling hands. These are all the incidents I witnessed, but was afraid to report. There are dates, times, and names of other officers who might be willing to talk now. Rodriguez gestured to the chair across from her desk. Have a seat, Officer Chen. And thank you for coming forward. She opened the folder, quickly scanning its contents. This must have been difficult to compile. Chen nodded, her face showing both relief and worry. Some of these go back 2 years. I should have said something sooner, but... She paused, collecting her thoughts. After what happened last night, I realized I couldn't stay quiet anymore. As they discussed the contents of the folder, Rodriguez's phone kept buzzing with notifications. The department's Internal Affairs Division had scheduled an emergency meeting. The police chief wanted to discuss immediate reforms. Civil rights organizations were calling for broader investigations into other departments. You know, Rodriguez said, looking up from the documents, what happened last night wasn't just about Officer Wilson. It was about breaking the silence that protects bad behavior. She pulled out a fresh notepad. Tell me everything you've seen, Officer Chen. Every detail matters. For the next 2 hours, Chen shared story after story. Some were small incidents, others were serious violations. Rodriguez took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. This was how real change happened, not through dramatic confrontations, but through patient, detailed documentation and brave people willing to speak up. Around noon, Officer Rivera arrived with his own statement. He looked nervous but determined. I've talked to some other officers, he said. They want to come forward too. Things we've seen, things we were told to ignore. Rodriguez's office became a steady stream of officers throughout the day, each bringing their own pieces of the puzzle. Some were reluctant, others eager to finally unburden themselves. She listened to them all, building a comprehensive picture of the department's problems. By late afternoon, she had filled 3 notepads with statements and testimonies. Her desk was covered with documents, but more importantly, she had something even more valuable: a growing network of officers who wanted to be part of the solution. Agent Rodriguez, her supervisor, appeared in the doorway, looking impressed at the stack of evidence she'd collected. The chief of police is here for your meeting. Rodriguez stood up, straightening her jacket. Tell him I'll be right there. She gathered her notes and the original case file, including the recording from the previous night. This meeting would set the tone for everything that followed. Before leaving her office, she glanced at a photo on her desk, her graduation day from the FBI Academy. She remembered the promise she'd made to herself that day, to protect not just the law, but the people it was meant to serve. Yesterday's traffic stop hadn't just exposed one officer's misconduct. It had cracked open a door that would lead to real, lasting change. As she walked to the conference room, Rodriguez thought about all the people who had faced discrimination without having the power to fight back. Today, she wasn't just an FBI agent doing her job. She was their voice, their advocate, their chance for justice. And she was ready to make that chance count. 3 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the changes in the police department were remarkable. Rodriguez stood at the back of the training room, watching as Officer Chen led a workshop on community engagement and bias recognition. The room was filled with officers, both veterans and rookies, all paying close attention. Remember, Chen was saying, our badge isn't just about authority. It's about responsibility. Every interaction we have shapes how our community sees us. She clicked to the next slide, which showed statistics from the past quarter. The number of civilian complaints had dropped significantly. Rodriguez smiled, thinking about how far they'd come. The investigation had revealed deep-rooted problems, but it had also shown how many good officers were ready for change. Wilson had resigned rather than face an internal hearing, and several other officers with troubling records had followed suit. Her phone buzzed with a message from Officer Rivera. He was now heading the department's newly formed Community Oversight Committee, working directly with neighborhood leaders to build trust. You need to see this, his message read, followed by a link to a local news article. The headline made her pause. Local police department becomes model for reform. The article detailed how their changes were being studied by other departments across the state. Rodriguez had been interviewed for the piece, but she'd made sure the spotlight stayed on the officers who'd chosen to be part of the solution. After the workshop, Chen approached her with a fresh stack of reports. Agent Rodriguez, you should see these numbers. Arrests are down, but successful case resolutions are up. Turns out, when people trust us, they actually want to help us solve crimes. Rodriguez nodded, remembering her own mother's words about trust being earned one interaction at a time. The department had implemented new training programs, revised their complaint procedures, and established clear consequences for misconduct. But more importantly, they'd changed the culture. Agent Rodriguez, a young officer she didn't recognize, approached nervously. I wanted to thank you. I just graduated from the academy last month, and, well, the changes you helped make here, they're why I chose this department. I want to be part of something that makes a real difference. Later that afternoon, Rodriguez sat in her office, updating her final report on the investigation. Her wall now displayed photos from community outreach events. Officers playing basketball with local kids, attending neighborhood meetings, and participating in cultural celebrations. Each image represented a small step toward healing old wounds. Her supervisor knocked on her door, carrying a familiar-looking briefcase. Remember this? The one from the traffic stop. He placed it on her desk. The director wants you to present your findings at the National Law Enforcement Conference next month. Your work here is changing policies across the country. Rodriguez opened the briefcase, now filled with success stories instead of complaints. She found herself thinking about that night 3 months ago. One incident, one moment of standing firm, had sparked a chain reaction that was still growing. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a reminder about Sunday dinner. Her mother had invited Officer Chen and her family to join them this week. It was a small thing, but it represented everything they'd been working toward: breaking down barriers, building connections, creating understanding. As she packed up for the day, Rodriguez glanced out her window at the city skyline. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, just like that evening 3 months ago. But something was different now. The city felt more connected, more hopeful. A text from Rivera popped up. Just handled a traffic stop. The driver actually thanked me afterward. Said she felt safe and respected. This is what change looks like. Rodriguez smiled, typing back a quick response. This was indeed what change looked like. Not dramatic confrontations or quick fixes, but steady, persistent work to build trust and accountability. The case that had started with one traffic stop had become something much bigger. A blueprint for transforming not just one department, but potentially law enforcement across the nation. As she headed home, Rodriguez thought about all the people who had played a part in this change. The officers who chose integrity over silence, the community members who gave them a chance to prove themselves, and even those who had documented that original traffic stop. Sometimes, the biggest changes started with one person willing to stand up and do the right thing, even when it wasn't easy.